I'm Rachel Jordan, Policy Analyst at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. Again, this is our Community Development Block Grant How to Apply workshop that you're all here for. On the call, we have some DHCD staff. Matt Weaver here is also going to be presenting with me. And then we have Kelly and Bill, some names and faces that should be familiar.
It's great being with you all this morning. See a lot of names, familiar names, but also some new faces. And those of you that haven't been involved in it, how to apply before, we'll run through a lot of information. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, come off mute, ask questions as we go through it, or you can wait till the end and we'll stick around and kind of answer some project specific questions. And then Rachel and I, as well as all the DHC staff, are always available afterward too to think through project ideas for the Community Development Block Grant Program. But without further ado, we'll get started. Look forward to doing one of these in person again sometime soon. But for now, we will stick with the virtual format. So DHCD has been administering the Community Development Block Grant funds almost since they were started back in the 70s. We have a pretty robust program serving the entire state, tip to tip, and most of the rural areas. But if you're not familiar with Cdbg, the main kind of impetus is the 3 national objectives: benefiting low to moderate income, removing or eliminating slum and blight, and then addressing urgent community development needs. The majority, over 70%, 75% of our statewide funds go to that meeting the low to moderate income benefit. Right, you go next slide. So essentially, we want to use this as an opportunity to go through some of the program, but also then dive in specifically. If you're familiar with Cdbg, there's an entitlement program and a non-entitlement program. The statewide funds serve the non-entitlement areas, generally are more rural areas. Your larger cities get their own Cdbg funds, but the statewide funds serve the majority of the rural areas from tip to tip and north to south, east, west, tip, tip, north, south. But it also has to go to a unit of local government as the grantee. So if you're a nonprofit or a interested community party, you'll have to work with your unit of local government to apply. It's not too difficult to be coordinated and have pass-through funding, but just to let you know that eligible applicant is the unit of local government. The how to apply serves as a kind of our impetus to roll out the program design for 2023. This is where you'll find all of our guidance for how the program is to be administered. It works in conjunction with the application guidelines, as well as our grant management manual, which from soup to nuts, the program design to the manual will cover the entire program, as well as what you're going to get into and what's expected of you once you're awarded funding. For 2023, this is kind of the breakdown for the amount of money we expect to roll out. And so essentially we have $18 million from our allocation. That's what we as a state are awarded from HUD. And then we're expecting to roll over about $3.5 million from our 2022 program. Those were from projects that didn't quite materialize through the application process like we had thought they would. So that's great because we'll actually have upwards of $21 million, almost $22 million to put into projects for 2023. The competitive process is where we put most of our funding, and that is a one-time-a-year application process. We'll go through that a little more in detail later on, but we're going to actually be putting out almost $14 million in the competitive process this year. So it's 13 million and change. And the planning grants will actually be $1 million. And then the open submission funds, which again, we'll touch on in a few minutes in more depth, but we'll keep $6 million for those open submission fund projects or programs listed there, as well as the $1 million. So essentially, we're going to put out $21 million. Know that we actually have a little bit extra money, which is nice to be able to fund additional projects. So we're going to go into some of the program changes for 2023. And the first one is kind of our program timeline. Normally, if you've applied to Cdbg, you're scurrying right now to develop an application and submit it toward the end of March or early April. we're actually rolling all the application processes back a little bit this year. It gives us a little more time to get our contract from HUD before we start taking applications and awarding projects. So this is simply kind of aligning the state program with some of the HUD program timelines better. So the competitive process, those applications are due in June, and then our open submission programs will open in July. And we'll keep those open on a rolling basis going through the end of the year. But we kind of condensed that timing a little bit, just down to 6 months, and then we're pushing everything back a few months. So take note. That's why we're having the how to apply this late in the year, which is, I think, hopefully a nice change for some of you. You can scramble for some of the other applications you've submitted as opposed to having Cdbg right in there with it. The next slide, we'll go through some even more program changes. So essentially, if you're were aware, we in 2021 made public services an eligible kind of program area. We're continuing having that be in the 2023 program also. We're just, instead of having so many opportunities for public services, we're dwindling it down to just 3 main service areas. Those are childcare programs, health service programs, and food security programs. The max award there is $250,000. And so then for a regional or multi-locality project, you can go up to $500,000. The idea there is to actually fund operations more so than the facility. So this is great workforce or manufacturing workforce development type projects we've seen. So the idea of reducing to 500,000 is actually hopefully going to make it even more streamlined to get some of these resources into the hands of the either the community colleges, the nonprofits, or the localities actually driving some of the projects forward. And there was a question about, I can't see reading the above, but oh, Rachel says your recording may have stopped. So just a heads up. Thanks for letting us know, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. I did restart it. Thanks.
Next slide, please, Rachel. So mention the timeline for open submission. Essentially, these are applications that are on a rolling basis. So from July to December 31st, locality can apply for an open submission project, and we can review it and have a dialogue going back and forth as to what's going on with that project. Why is the timing good now? How do we, finish off the application process? It's more of a conversation for an application as opposed to having a tried and true deadline. Your application is due on one date and you get one try at it. This is a chance to think through fully what's going on with those applications in these program areas. So the open submission, we mentioned public services. Construction ready water and sewer is for those projects that have a final design, have environmental reviews done, and you have a gap funding need for a construction of a water or sewer project. Those are usually very quick to get approved as well as get under contract. We mentioned local innovation. Community economic development or for creating jobs. So if you have an industry coming in or you're on the hook for doing development for industry recruitment, this can help you. It's $35,000 per job, and that can go toward the water and sewer, broadband, electricity, some of the road work potentially. But it's for infrastructure related to industry recruitment. Scattered site housing is an open submission application now to actually create housing in a scattered site mentality. It's not our first preference. I'll say the priority for us to do housing rehabilitation or housing production is in a neighborhood approach. So looking at kind of a clustered area or a targeted area. Scattered site is an option though when you've done several different neighborhood or targeted area housing projects, and then you're looking at a more scattered site to either fill in areas that were missed or just outside of a target area that are too rural. So we can think through that as an open submission project with you, but we'll generally push you more toward target area housing rehab as a first step, as opposed to scattered site as a first step. And urgent need is a different national objective from low to moderate income. So it has its own categories. It has to be usually a natural disaster is what we have been using these funds for. So it has a declaration of emergency from the governor, or it has a declaration of health from the state health commissioner. So they require some different aspects to get urgent need funds, but we can attempt to kind of solve or help be a part of the solution to address community needs after a natural disaster. And then lastly, the Regional Water Wastewater Fund is a large scale infrastructure development opportunity for multiple localities working together to build out a water system. So whether it's taking over a system that's excuse me, poorly maintained or hasn't been able to be upgraded, or if it's actually building out and expanding a system so that you can serve unserved areas and bringing in new players into that. We've had some good success in the last couple of years with that fund, but it's up to $2.5 million for that Regional Water Wastewater Fund. And a couple of questions. The maximum amount per connection based on the number of connections in the system or the number of connections in the proposed project area? And it's a great question, Robert. So essentially, a project area, you would look at the number of connections for that project area. For Cdbg, you have to have at least 51% of those households in that project area be low to moderate income. And then you would look at how many of those households are LMI and how many are actually connecting. So essentially, we look at localities that have a mandatory hookup ordinance and weigh favorably on those that will be connecting. But oftentimes we understand those are not enforced. And so if the water for evaluation of application is deemed as passed by the house, that's a per connection. We do, in the evaluation process, you do get more points for having connection signed participation from each household, saying they will connect or they won't connect. And so that's where there's some due diligence to make sure it's not just the number of houses you're passing with a water sewer, but it's actually the people that are going to hook up and take advantage of that service. And then another question. Thanks, Eddie. Attendees may have control over turning the recording off and on. Yeah, if you do, leave it on so we can all enjoy ourselves later on, but that's a good note for the future for us, Eddie. Appreciate that. This is all a big learning process. It's like you think it's going to be easy, and then technology throws you a curve. It's actually our IT department, but they're wonderful people. So we'll go through the competitive grants, and then we're going to dive, after we go through a few more slides talking about program information, we'll dive into actually some specific examples of what you can do to make your projects better. And so for rehabilitation of housing units to DHCD housing rehabilitation standards, or we do housing production, which is to construct new housing units. So for Cdbg, we can't put the money actually into the housing unit itself without a lot of extra red tape. So for housing rehab, we can actually address the inside, the outside of the housing unit. But for housing production, we'll do a lot of the infrastructure. So for the water, sewer, and some of the road work leading into a housing site, oftentimes we've seen that from multifamily housing, where other funding builds the actual units, and Cdbg can address a lot of the infrastructure needs to lower the cost for that development. So the definition of housing rehab is generally to bring a house up to housing rehab standards. It can go into minor fixes of HVAC or some of the siding. It can go into a full-blown, we're having to tear this house down and rebuild it on the same footprint and build a completely new house, substantial reconstruction. So housing rehab can take on kind of multiple forms. Infill is a challenge. So if there wasn't a house there before, it's really hard for us to infill. We can do it on a case-by-case basis, but that would be as you're developing a project area. If you have identified areas for infill, let us know, and we'll try to think through what's the best resource for doing that activity in the overall project scope. And so that's a great kind of lead into comprehensive community development. This is where you do have a project area where you're tackling multiple activities. Usually it's a water, sewer, road work, and housing. We like to see housing as the major component for comprehensive community development projects. So, you're rehabbing housing as well as making sure all the water and sewer lines are appropriate there. You have a place where you don't have appropriate ingress or egress for emergency vehicles. So doing some road work, minor road work to make it a safer place, as well as housing rehab. You can do it a pretty, it's a hopefully enough resources to make it comprehensively improved area with that resource. So public infrastructure is just that, water and wastewater. We can do some drainage and some streetscape improvements. So if you have just a drainage only project, let us know, because we'll probably have to think through with you on that, how that builds out. But for water and sewer, it's pretty much, that's our bread and butter for public infrastructure. Community service facilities, we'll have a great slide here in a few minutes about one of our recent awards, but it's a funding to help build or rehabilitate a facility for workforce training, healthcare. We've done different type of dental clinics. We've even recently done some childcare. Adult daycare type facilities are sometimes easier. So just it's usually for facilities to help with a community service need. And then lastly, business district revitalization is to revitalize a downtown or a commercial corridor or area. This is kind of the slum and blight removal. So you're going to have to focus on facade upgrades, facade improvements, and then kind of the public facing infrastructure, hopefully to leverage then the private side to redo the businesses, bring in more businesses, and make that a viable area again. Next slide, please, Rachel. So for our housing rehabilitation and housing production programs, we're raising the cap up to 1.25 million. That's just in general, more cost mean a larger area. However, we're not raising our housing cost limits at this time. I think there's cases for raising some of them in different aspects, and there's also a desire to look at what we're doing and maximize the resources we have. So we often do leverage other projects or other funding sources in these housing projects. You mentioned weatherization, and lead has a reduction on this slide, but there's numerous other state agency and federal agency funds that go toward housing rehab. And so thinking through how we combine those funds most appropriately is one reason why we haven't raised our housing cost limits at this time. I will say that these housing, you don't have to do a $1.25 million project. If you stop at $1 million or even 700,000 because you have a smaller project area, that's not a detriment to your project. If you come with, we're going to do 7 houses, do them well, rehab them well, and rehab them quickly, that may have a higher priority and weighting than in the application process than if you go for a 1.25 with 18 houses, and it's going to take you 4 years to build the whole thing out. So think through how you're going to do that. But we have raised the overall project award. These funds usually go toward the rehabilitation and overall kind of repair of houses. If you have pre-78 houses, the exploration of, is there lead in the house? Do we need to do lead abatement and other stabilization activities for those pre-78 houses will kind of take effect. There's also DHR and other reviews that you'll have to, historic resources that you'll have to think through depending on what your project area might be or look like. Next slide, Rachel. So we'll hit a couple of these real quickly. For housing rehabilitation, oftentimes we see areas that just don't have a good concentration, and we understand why. In some of the rural areas, you have houses spread out in a big area, but if you have a project area where only 24 houses of 50 houses are going to be assisted, we may need to look at kind of how we're drawing the area, or should we do a project with 24 houses? Can we cut it down to 10 or 12 and do a phased approach in that area? So think through what's the number that's appropriate for your area. How many signed participation agreements you're getting. For housing rehab project, having participation agreements, having them updated with less than a year, and having them show the income eligibility is crucial for an application. If those are outdated to start with, then the application is questionable, and it's going to be hard to score well with outdated or not updated materials. So think through your project area. We're always available to kind of think that with you. And it may be paring it down to make it a little bit more manageable and doing a phased approach across the overall area. So next slide, please, Rachel. And so this next slide, this is the housing summary table. Not the most glamorous, but it definitely gets us a lot of information we need for the Cdbg application. So again, we're looking at overall project area, the number of LMI units, and then the number that it helps us understand the number that we're not going to be serving also. So that's kind of the impetus of giving us the most information we can and trying to think through the greatest impact for that project area. If you have any questions as you go into the housing summary table or any of our attachments, if you've done a Cdbg application, you know that half the application is in the attachments, if not more. And so these are, again, not always the most glamorous, but they are crucial to us being able to evaluate the application. Next slide, Rachel. So for these comprehensive projects that have 2 or maybe even 3 major activities, we're increasing the award amount just slightly to 1.3 million plus admin, and then 1.6 million plus admin. It doesn't give you it's about $100,000 difference than last year. So it may allow you to do 1 or a half a house more. Not huge, but again, the emphasis is on the actual activities and making sure that the project area is built out in an appropriate manner. So the water and sewer, if you have a rural area that's not on public water and sewer, making sure that folks have adequate septic or alternative systems, making sure they have wells and access to water would be a critical piece of having a comprehensive approach. For these, we have in the past allowed for different stormwater, and so if you're in kind of the eastern side of Virginia, having a lot of regulations that apply to where water is channeled and how it's taken care of, this can help with. Know that sometimes DEQ and DHR have to be involved in environmental review processes for some of these project areas. I'm sure many of you are more aware of that than we are, but kind of thinking through those aspects as you're building out the projects helps. In this case, comprehensive can mean a longer lead time. We have planning grants that can help you kind of think through the overall project, but these comprehensive community developments are great ways to really maximize the overall Cdbg involvement and the benefit to the community. All right, next one, Rachel. So I mentioned that public infrastructure is, a kind of a heavily weighted, heavily funded type of project in Cdbg for the state. Water and sewer needs, whether it's new service and in some cases replacement, is a high priority. Our weighting structure in the application still puts new service as a higher priority in the scoring than replacements. We have seen more replacement projects be funded in the competitive process in recent years, though. So for those of you that have communities with 30, 50, 60, 100-year-old pipes, replacing those may be an option with Cdbg. But through the competitive process, it's not always as high of a priority. So we are raising the per connection, so 30,000 and 50,000. Again, it has to be a 51% area. So if you have 100 households, at least 51 of those have to be LMI. And having user agreements, signed user agreements that show we would hook up, and this is what the fee we're willing to pay, or we know we're going to be charged for having this new service. Having those be updated and very clear for us to understand is crucial for an application. And I mentioned the Build America, Buy America. That's going to happen in this category mostly. So it affects, there's iron and steel. Yeah, so for 250 projects that have a $250,000 award or greater. So almost every award in this category is going to fall under that Build America, Buy America program requirements. So just think through that as you're starting out to build out a potential public infrastructure project. We'll have more guidance again on our website as well as in the program materials, and then can think through that with you in project development conversations in the next few weeks too.
Hi, Matt. This is Amanda. Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
Thanks. So the Build America, Buy America is not just limited to CDBG funds. If you use other federal funds in your project and that kicks it up above 250,000, if you have 250 from CDBG and $1 million from somebody else, it's still likely to be a requirement of this. Note that it is project award, not contract. So even if you have smaller contracts under the $250,000 limit, if we are investing $250 into the project overall, it triggers the BABA requirements. There is a lot of discussion going on about exactly what the rollout of this will look like. And so when we know how to interpret and apply more thoroughly, we will certainly share that with you. Thanks, Matt.
No, thank you. That's a great comment. And Ashley, to your question of whether BABA will also be applicable to comprehensive projects with water and sewer, yes, it will. And so that's where we'll have to think through the involvement of those those requirements for those projects. I mean, if some of you are familiar with other federal requirements that have, required American-made, it's similar, and so it will just be another requirement we'll have to work through. It shouldn't be a limiting factor in what you're doing, because hopefully some of the project award increases allow for increases in project costs. That's an assumption, so it could be inaccurate, and we can adjust in future years, but we'll help work with you through these as we learn more. I don't think it should be an impediment to applying, but if you have major concerns, please do let us know and we'll think through it. Next slide, Rachel. And so I mentioned community service facilities, and this is the Calfee School that we just funded with Cdbg as well as Appalachian Regional Commission funds a few years back. And it's a interesting kind of childcare is associated with economic development. So they have several industries that are committing to fund and help kind of put children into these LMI children into the service, but it also brings in a commercial kitchen, a museum for the school and its history, as well as community space through other funding. Cdbg went mainly into the child care and some of the renovations. So it's a good mix of funding sources, but the community service project is actually to create that, solve some of the community needs. And childcare has become a big one. It's not always the easiest to fund with Cdbg funds from our perspective, but we're happy to think through projects with you. And then for a community service facility, you have to have at least 51% benefit, direct benefit to low to moderate income. It can't be a kind of an ancillary or a zigzag line to that benefit. We have to have a direct kind of LMI benefits, make sure we are meeting our HUD requirements. But they're great facilities and great projects, especially for rural areas that need some of these services. And so Robert, you had asked what source do we use to determine LMI, census tracts or locality based? And Kelly provided an answer. She worked with the Califia School directly and has some great inside knowledge into kind of how to develop some of that LMI data. And both census and direct surveys will be required. In this instance, where we did an economic development kind of approach, we also had to have direct solicitation from businesses, from the industries to say, our employees are of this percentage LMI, and therefore, they're going to need access to childcare. So it was a combination of both census and surveying. And if there's the ability, you'll see the acronym LMA. It's low to moderate income area, as defined by HUD. That can open up a few resources also. So Vaughn post, is BABA something we'll have to monitor with respect to our contractors and the materials that required? And so Amanda Healy provided a response saying it looks that way at this point. I think with more determination needed to make that, full on, but it says in the 2023 CDBG contracts, all the we'll have to monitor that, as well as need to be reflected in local bid docs and the contracts for those projects. Amanda, do you want to expound on that?
Only to say that a number of us have been hearing increasing amounts about BABA, and speaking only for myself, I'm having some anxiety and red flags about it. But what we do know is that there is a lot more information that we are waiting for from HUD, that they're still figuring it out, and once they figure it out, they'll let us know. I do want to note that this is for our 2023 project and beyond. If you currently have a CDBG project, this is not retroactive. So if you're currently working with us, breathe a sigh of relief, but know that this is coming and it's going to be a thing.
Sometimes you leave me speechless, Amanda.
Maybe I should be more speechless.
Well, no, you're perfect. That was great. We'll keep navigating through it. Kathy posted a link to the HUD mapping tool, and it is a great resource. If you're working in a project area, you can actually put in the address in this tool, and it'll help you identify some of the census information. And if HUD has deemed your area per this tool as a 51% community, so it's 60%, 53% LMI, that low moderate income area benefit can be applied, which helps make the justification for your application a little easier. So that's a great resource as you're developing projects. Take a glance at that. Pretty user friendly, but if you do have any questions, we're happy to think through that. And then, Jennifer asking about, can the LMI status be determined with the planning grant? And absolutely, that's a great use of planning grants, not just to determine the LMI status, but also participation rates and structure, get people involved, have community meetings where you can describe the project, get information or input on how to build out the project. Planning grants are a great resource to develop any of these project types, but several of them are really geared toward, getting community buy-in to help you build out the project, as opposed to, which will help build a solid application. So there's an application or a question, excuse me, Kenny has a question about the dam that needs to be replaced with a roadway above and a water line following the roadway. Dams are not generally eligible through the CDBG program just because of the complexity of how to demonstrate the direct low to moderate income benefit of that project. So it'd be a challenge to show that. But if the housing and some of the water line had a direct LMI benefit, we could try to think through what that would be and look at that project. It sounds like a complex one, but I'm happy to think through that one with you, Kenny. And then Kelly reiterated that, planning grants are a great way to get those direct surveys and LMI confirmations before applying. Great questions, y'all, and comments. Rachel, next slide, please. And so this slide, I just noticed a little out of place. This is actually an open submission program, but one worth noting and kind of aligns well with, thinking through the Calfee School example. This is again, community economic development is where we help with industry recruitment generally. So if you have an industry coming in, or if you have an industry that says we have a huge need and we may not be able to keep operating here without addressing that need, if you can get some kind of industry, a locality or a nonprofit, there's been some really awesome loan pool opportunities with, in conjunction with the downtown revitalization process. There's been some great work. Some commerce and some development in your community. And so it's up to $1 million. And again, it does have to be kind of that public facing infrastructure. So redoing the facades, doing some of the landscaping, the street work, wayfinding signage potentially, kind of thinking through what's going to make this area attractive for getting more private leverage and private investment into that. So the standards we have in place are 25, it's at least 25% blighted, which means you have buildings that are, crumbling. You have really kind of chipping paint, the classic blighted type avenue. The Cdbg program does not, we don't have a direct description of blight. The locality or the applicant is able to define blight, but it has to be pretty logical and pretty evident to meet that 25%. There's also the ability to talk about the vacancy rate, and you have at least 50% vacancies. So that's what we call economic blight. You're not able to attract businesses into these communities. You're not able to keep businesses. Why? How could these funds be able to help you increase that occupancy rate and think through, again, creating a vibrant space? This is a great place if you are thinking about a BDR to think through a planning grant. The main document getting out of a planning grant is the economic restructuring plan or an economic development strategy. And so this is going to walk you through or walk us through what the community thinks the plan is for creating this vibrancy and the vitality back into that space. This is a great resource also to partner with some of our other DHCD and non-DHCD sources. I saw some Main Street folks and some Industrial Revitalization Fund folks from DHCD on the call today. We have some awesome resources that can go into helping really build out a economic restructuring plan for a community. So it's a great way to start and get the citizens engaged up front so that then they're riding along the path with you. Next slide, please. And this can be the kickoff to kind of think through some of the application needs, as well as some of the kind of common mistakes and things that you'll want to avoid in your application. But essentially for BDRs, if you don't have like a clearly defined 25 or 50% blight rate, we have a hard time defining that for projects. We don't know it as well as you all, but then if we can't figure out exactly what's going on, we can't fund it. That's one of those things of not having a definition of blight is an advantage and a disadvantage. But if we can't determine what's going on with your community, with your plan, then we're not going to be able to kind of see that truly through to make sure we hit our national objective of eliminating slum and blight. The big thing, like again, facade improvements are the kind of bread and butter of a business district revitalization project. So if you don't have agreements and or thoughtful ideas for those improvements going into it, appropriate costs for how much it's going to be for those facades and agreements from the owners to participate, the program's not going to move forward. We have some projects currently that, had great intentions, but then when you get down to it, the business owners is not in agreement. So that's where if you have thoughtful conversations up front, you can hopefully move the project forward quickly. We have gotten rid of our facade participation match requirements. We used to require a 1-to-1. So if we put money on the outside, someone would put money on the inside. We've gotten rid of that requirement to hopefully encourage more facade participation. But thinking through that up front, how you're going to get that participation and agreement and make sure that people are staying engaged about the process would be really, really helpful. And that's kind of I think the biggest takeaway for your application for a BDR project. And BT, I agree. There's great things going on in Boone's Mill. If anybody's traveling south on 220, hop on into Boone's Mill. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. And again, if you have questions or if you have thoughts on the application process, feel free to throw them out. We'd love to learn along with you all.
Great, thanks, Matt. So now we're going to be getting a little bit more into the details of the competitive application and review process. So our competitive projects, they're scored on a scale of up to 100 points for different categories. These are the types of categories on this slide. The national objective and the composite fiscal stress score, as well as regional priorities. Those first three are just kind of like the general, making sure you're meeting the requirements that apply to any CDBG project to make sure you're eligible. And then we score a little bit more in more detail for the costs and commitments, and then project specific evaluation. And these include community priorities. So a lot of the community priorities are checking to make sure that this project does meet a community priority. And that depends on what you submit to us. So your comprehensive plans, any community studies, your public meetings are important to demonstrate that the project meets a community need. Stakeholder involvement, we check to make sure all the roles are filled for the grant management team and whoever's going to be managing the grant long term. As well as like for a BDR grant, if businesses are invested and committed to the project as well. Readiness, this is a big one. Is it going to be construction ready? Capacity, this is the local and community capacity. And then the long-term impact of the project. Will it create a long-term impact? Housing, BDR, all of these do have a long-term impact, but we do look to see how you're demonstrating that. So now we're going to go into some helpful tips and common mistakes that we see pretty much every year. So this slide is about the public hearings. 2 are required. They have to be at least 7 days apart and advertised at least 7 days prior and held at least 7 days apart. The first public hearing is like a general talk about what the locality wants to do, how much funding they want to put towards a project, and the discussion of previous CDBG investment, if the locality has done that, as well as taking the minutes from that meeting, whatever city the board or council discusses, as well as any public comments. The second public hearing is more specific about the CDBG project that you're applying to. And again, we look for those minutes and that discussion and community feedback. As part of the application, you will need to submit a copy of the ad, as well as a receipt for wherever the ad was run, and the timestamp, somehow get the time on there when it was advertised, to make sure it was done at least 7 days prior. And then we will need the approved minutes from those meetings, and any like attendance lists of attendees in that meeting. And then we do have an appendix with all of these details and some information on the public hearings in our program design as well. So these are just a couple of good examples. The model advertisement, we have a copy of this. We are more than happy to send to you. It's just boilerplate language that you can use as a template for wherever you're going to run your ad. These two photos are just examples. One is a flyer. It's pretty, it's catchy, has the information clearly labeled. And then the middle one is a copy of where an ad is run in the local newspaper. So as we mentioned, there's the increase from $2.5 million to a $3 million open Cdbg cap. If you have any current projects that are close to the $3 million limit, but you're going to be closing out soon and you don't want to count them towards the 3 million cap, they need to be closed out by June 1st or prior to when you submit your new competitive application. You'll need to attach your assurances, copies of ads, and copies of all notices, a transmittal letter to your PDC. We encourage reaching out to your PDC earlier rather than later, and they're a great resource. They can help you, connect you to any partners you may need. And for PDCs or localities, the PDCs will submit the regional priorities by June 1st, and those will be sent out either later this week or next week, so be on the lookout for that. So these are some of our more common mistakes. In the costs and commitment section of where those applications are scored, the documentation of leveraged funds, we can only count leveraged funds as committed, and they're only committed when you attach, make sure you attach, not just have them, signed commitment letters from the locality, businesses, nonprofit organizations, whoever is submitting funds to you, state grants, federal grants. We have to have a copy of the signed funding commitment letter in order for it to count as leverage. For project-specific evaluation, particularly for housing rehab and business district, the participation agreements from all the houses in the project area have to be signed and attached in the attachments tab, as well as businesses that are going to be participating in like a BDR project. Signed facade participation agreements must be attached as well for BDR projects. Any easements, or if there's going to be acquisition as part of the project, the environmental review record, we specifically have a question or a scoring area on our scoring criteria checking for environmental review. How far along are you? Is it done? Is it published? So make sure you have that in order. I would recommend, highly encourage you to expedite, prioritize the environmental review. And then any procurement. We know procurement is complicated. So yeah, they can be an obstacle to being construction ready and ready to roll out. Project needs and outcomes, mapping deficiencies. We love pretty maps. I know I do. But what is really needed is a clearly defined project area. Maps that are labeled that include a legend are helpful. And yeah, the project has to have a clear connection to other plans or studies. So connecting that map to if it came from like a feasibility study or a community study, market study, or a comprehensive plan, somehow tie that in if possible. So this map, it could be great, but if you notice, the legend has no definition of what those are. LMI, I couldn't even guess, maybe owner occupied, but I'm just guessing. So yeah, this is a pretty, well, fairly defined project area, but also why are there colors outside of the red lined area? That's not clear either. So this is just a not great example. This map also could be a lot better. It's not very clear why there are letters and numbers and different colors, and then why those houses and not the other houses up there. So we just need a clear map. So this is a good mapping example. All the houses are labeled. It's a clear neighborhood or project area. The numbers, it seems that there's an attached building inventory which would list out the addresses, what kind of rehab is being done associated with those numbers. For multi-phase projects, it's helpful to, and within an attachment, you can attach more than one map, just FYI, but here, so it looks like they're applying for a phase 2 of the housing rehab project. Phase 1 shows what's done. Phase 2, the rental rehab and then substantial reconstruction, labeled by different colors, as well as the housing units to receive the rehab are numbered. So physical inventory, this can be for housing as well as comprehensive and business district revitalization projects. This would be associated with a map, most likely. The units are numbered, the address, what kind of building it is, like if it's business district, is it a business building, commercial building, housing, whatever. And then what kind of light it has or what level of housing rehab it's going to need. So getting into our costs and commitment section, 75 points are available for the costs and commitment section by itself. Here, as I mentioned before, we can only count leveraged funds if there's an attached funding commitment letter. Here, it looks like some of these funds they have applied for, but they have not been approved yet. Or they're approved, but they didn't provide the letter. So here we couldn't count any of their leveraged funds, even though they have a significant amount, because they didn't have any funding commitment letters. So they got 0 points for that, for local as well as non-CDBG committed funds. This is a big one. For housing rehab and comprehensive community development projects specifically, the data that you provide to demonstrate the LMI benefit is crucial. We ask for it in maybe 3 or 4 different places. So I know that's confusing, but every year, some of the numbers don't match or they are missing. For housing rehab projects, we have to have the signed participation agreements as well as the LMI documentation. So whether that's surveys or LMA data, LMA data, you can use the census data. But if you're doing smaller project areas and you're surveying individual households, we do need the copies of the income survey that you used to verify LMI status, and then the number of LMI units that are going to be receiving service in the project area. So a few slides ago that Matt covered, that it was a table with some brown colors. That is the part of the census information and compliance chart. That attachment template will be available in the CAMS application, or we can send it to you. But make sure that you fill that out. A point to keep in mind is that if you don't fill it out, and there are 0 numbers listed in the LMI, either we have to guess or it's going to be 0, and your application will be scored pretty poorly. So here, this is the scoring section for the LMI benefit for a previous housing rehab project. They were serving 85 LMI persons out of 157 total people, meeting an LMI benefit of 54%. While this does meet the minimum LMI benefit requirement, the other housing rehab applications that we received met 100% LMI benefit. So here they, this section is, they only received 5 out of 30 available points. And this was most likely due to they could have provided better LMI documentation. So just some other helpful tips. Submit any supporting documentation of community needs and how the project will address them. If you've had a market study done, a feasibility study done, if you've had a planning grant for the project area you're applying for, submit that, the products and outcomes of those projects. A comprehensive plan, any regional plans that your PDC has produced. Yeah, any way to show that this project meets a community need. We will appreciate that. We do look for that all the roles on the grant management team are filled at the time of application. And then providing documentation that the project is construction ready. We specifically ask or score a project based on its construction readiness. So we look for how many obstacles prevent it from being construction ready. So easements, acquisition, environmental record, environmental review record, zoning, PER, construction plans, all of these things play a role. So this is a good example of a project timeline, which we do ask for. It will be an attachment in the attachments tab. But this is just a clear, this is only part of it, but it has each time, the timeline is sectioned out by like what different categories of the project. So here they have the environmental review and when they expect it to be completed and which grant manager or staff is responsible for that task. And then, yeah, they go all the way down through procurement and cost estimates. And then we'll go all the way down to construction ready. So seeing this timeline is really helpful for us as well. So just the basic timeline for this. The application is due by 11:59 p.m. on June 1st. However, staff will only be available until 5 p.m. So just keep that in mind. All the application materials will be submitted in CAMS, either in the narrative section or the attachments tab. And you must provide all the required attachments. Especially, yeah, if you'll see it in there, a title for the attachment and then a template. You want to download that template unless you have your own, that's totally okay. But if there's a template, make sure an attachment is provided. And just another note on the timing, the application is about ready to go, so it should be available in CAMS by the end of the week. If you don't have a CAMS profile, I would go ahead and get that started now. It's pretty easy to create a profile. You just enter in the name, your DUNS number, as well as a recent audit. And then, yeah, you'll submit that. It'll get approved in like 2 to 3 days max. And then, yeah, make sure that you save your application often. And we have some, yeah, if you ever have any CAMS issues, I'm available. Matt, our I team, we have a CAMS help desk. So we're here to help you out with any issues you have with CAMS. On our website, if you can see this, I don't know if your screen shows just a lot of yellow, but if you go to our dhcd.virginia.gov, at the top, right next to the search bar, it has a link, Access CAMS. You'll just click that and that'll take you to the CAMS portal. And yeah, that's about it. This is our contact information. Matt Weaver is who was speaking earlier. I'm Rachel, and then we also have Kelly Carapich, who is our planning grant specialist. All of our emails are up here. Feel free to reach out with any questions. And yeah, just to go over it again, this recording as well as the slides will be available on our website. If not the end of this week, definitely next week, as well as our CAMS application will be open by the end of this week for competitive grants. Our planning grants and open submission will open July 1st. The regional priorities will be sent out next week. And then, yeah, and our program design is being finalized and should be on the website very soon, if not this week, next week. So be on the lookout for that. Does anybody have any questions before we close today?
Rachel, Matt, and Kelly, this is BT in Boones Mill. I just wanted to thank you all for doing this webinar and presentation. It's very, very helpful to for y'all to go through it and will help us move forward. So thank you for your time and efforts in putting this together and for the presentation.
Great, thanks.